Welcome back, everyone. I hope your studies of U.S. history have gotten off to a really good start. We are looking at the colonization of what is going to become the United States by the English. This video is specifically, obviously, going to be on the southern colonies. Keep in mind as we go through these are an overview of U.S. history, so we don't necessarily go into depth on a whole lot of things. This one is going to kind of cover all of the southern colonies. So let's go ahead and get started here. All right, so the first region in the southern colonies is referred to as the Chesapeake. That's going to be the areas of Maryland and Virginia. Okay, the Chesapeake region is named for Chesapeake Bay, and that's where Jamestown is going to be settled. So the thing with the Chesapeake in the colonial era, we're talking, the early 1600s, early to mid 1600s. The climate of the Chesapeake when the English got there is very, very harsh. It's got hot and humid summers. The environment kind of lends itself to breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and so the area is prone to disease outbreaks. There can be bad water that helps spread disease. So, all in all, it's kind of a bad place. The original settlers to the Chesapeake through the 1600s go through something that they start to refer to as the seasoning. Which has this kind of ominous sound, and it really should, because what the seasoning was referred to the first about 5 years of your life in the Chesapeake region, where you were learning how to survive, how to prepare for winter, because the winters can be kind of harsh. It also has to do with not just your preparations to survive, but also your body's ability to survive the disease and infections that you could get. Okay, the seasoning, by the end of that 5 years, everybody who's gone through it, there's this very high mortality rate, this very high death rate. But if you could survive 5 years, at the end of that 5 years, you were pretty much good to go. You didn't have to necessarily worry as much about, am I going to get some diseases and die, because basically you had already had all of them. And so you had built up that immunity, and you had learned, this is what I need to do to prepare for the winter. And this is what I need, what kind of shelter I need, and so on and so on. So that seasoning was a really big deal in the Chesapeake. To give you an idea of how big of a deal it was and the extremely high death rate that they experienced, we're going to look at Jamestown real quick. Jamestown between 1607 and 1618. So let's call that roughly 10 years. We'll round down just a little bit. Okay. During that time period, so during that roughly 10-year time period, 1,650 settlers were brought to Jamestown. So 1,650 people show up in town. So by the time you get to 1619, we should have a population, assuming nothing really changes, we should have a population of 1,650. Now, during that time period, 300 people go back to England. So subtract the 300. By the time we get to 1619, we should have approximately 1,350 people in Jamestown, assuming you have a proportional birth and death rate. In 1619, the population of Jamestown is 351. So we should have a population of 1,350. Instead, we only have a population of 351. We're missing 1,000 people. It's because they've gone through that seasoning and they didn't make it. Okay, so that's this extremely high death rate. It's going to remain high through the first half of the 1600s. Okay, it's just a harsh environment, and it's hard for these people to deal with it. Now, who were the people that came over? It came over in droves and kept coming, even though there was this high death rate. Well, early on, some of the first people that settled the Chesapeake region, some of them, a very small number of them, they were people that had money. And so, they're financing their way over. They've seen the opportunity to make more money. They're going to strike it rich. Most everybody who comes over thinks that in some way, somehow, they're going to strike it rich. They're going to make money. Now, the vast majority of people that end up coming to the Chesapeake are going to be England's poor. They're coming to the Chesapeake because they have the promise of a better life. Being poor in England for these folks meant that they were staring down the barrel of the gun. They are facing starvation. They're possibly homeless. Life is terrible. And so we're going to give them a chance to come to the Chesapeake. Now, there's this really high death rate. And these are people who say, you know what, even with that really high death rate, sign me up, because maybe my death rate at my rung of the social ladder is just the same here in England, and there is the chance I can survive and actually make something of myself if I get over there. So these poor people, they are so poor they cannot afford to pay for the voyage to come over. So they need to get somebody to pay for that voyage for them. And so these guys are going to come as indentured servants. Indentured servants, somebody pays for their passage over, and in exchange, they are going to work for that person who's going to end up being a landowner. They're going to work for that person. The average contract, this was a contract they entered into, the average contract lasted 7 years. So if you can imagine, coming over, you've agreed you're going to work for this person for 7 years. Like I said, that's an average. Some people worked a little bit longer. Some people worked a little bit less. Just depends on the person you're working for. It depends on the circumstances of your voyage. But you're going to work for them for 7 years before you are now able to go off and do your own thing. So what is their life like here when they get over to the colonies? The life of an indentured servant was actually pretty harsh. It's pretty bad. Okay, your movement is restricted. Okay, you're not allowed to go wherever you want because they didn't want to take the risk that you could run off. Okay, they still have to deal with the bad climate, so they're experiencing that very high death rate. Okay, they don't have the same rights as, I put in quotation marks here, a free person, because that's going to be the legal terminology that would be used in the colony. You have the free people, and then you have the indentured servants. Okay? Some of the things that they had to deal with this idea of not having the same rights as a free person, they could be beaten. If the indentured servant did not perform up to whatever standard it was, they could be beaten. So we have this drawing here of an indentured servant woman being beaten by another woman, the mistress of the house, okay, for whatever offense it is that she has committed. This is a newspaper ad, and we have 2 indentured servant girls. I'm going to use the bottom one down here. She is a Scotch servant girl. Okay, so she's Scottish, and it says up here to be sold. Okay, and this is kind of a misnomer. You might think, and I have definitely heard some people describe indentured service as, well, it was kind of like slavery. It was kind of not like slavery. Like, even though we've got the image of the woman being beat, even though we have the term to be sold here, they're not selling the person, they're selling the contract. Okay? If you look right here, okay, the Scotch girl who has almost 4 years to serve. Okay? So you're selling her contract. If you can imagine it being like the contracts of the professional athletes, they sign a contract with the team and they're going to play for them for 10 years or whatever. And after a couple of years, it's not working out, and the Yankees say, "Hey, we want to trade or sell this contract to somebody else." That's what's going on here. But that's just it. If you're landowner decided they wanted to get rid of you and send you down the road to another landowner, they could sell your contract and you're done. And, if you committed some offense, they could potentially enact legal uh, proceedings against you, and they could add to your contract. So you don't have all the same rights. You do have some of the same rights because you're still an English person, but you don't have all the same rights because you're under that contract. Now, as an indentured servant, you do, because of that contract, have the opportunity to get some good stuff. After the completion of your indenture, you were given certain things. These were written into the contract. First of all, you got 50 acres of land. That's a big deal. You're probably moving there. You're probably going to be farming, and so you've gotten some experience farming. So they're going to give you this land that you can clear and live on. For us nowadays, this may not seem like a big deal, but it was a big deal back in the day. They're going to give you a fresh set of clothing. Back in the day, you may only have one or two pairs of clothing. So, here you go. This is a big deal for the year. You would also be given a barrel of whatever the local crop was. What is it that we're growing around here to make money? When we're talking about the Chesapeake, we're likely talking about tobacco. It's possible you could have some people that were given a barrel of corn to grow, but for the most part, it's going to be tobacco seeds. So you take your 50 acres of land, you take those seeds, you plant them, and then depending on the contract that was negotiated, they might also get tools in order to plant their tobacco, could also receive some kind of cash, could receive some other kind of incentives. So the contract, once you fulfilled it, this is actually really good because you're a landowner now, and we're giving you the crop that you would be able to sell to make more money to potentially buy land. So if you can survive the seasoning, if you can make it through your contract, you have now arrived and your life has improved. That's why so many of these people took the risk, because there was this gold nugget at the end if they could just get there. Now, in Virginia, they're still going to have a problems of getting people. There are other places you can go as an indentured servant, and the climate's not as harsh. The environment's not as bad. So they're still having problems getting people. You still have that really high death rate. Some people in England are starting to figure this out. They're maybe hesitating about whether or not they want to go. You also have landowners who, I'm going to shell out all this money to bring indentured servants over, and a lot of them are going to die. I'm not getting a financial benefit out of this. In fact, I'm getting a financial hit because the people I'm paying to come over and work for me aren't making it. So in Virginia, they come up with this thing called the headright system. The headright system was designed to encourage landowners to keep bringing indentured servants over. Okay? If it's not financially worth it for me as a landowner to bring people over, I'm not going to bring them over. And so the colony of Virginia, the government of Virginia says, okay, we're going to try to incentivize this. What the government did, the government of Virginia said, we are going to give you, the landowner, 50 acres of land every time you pay for someone to come over. So if I bring over one person, they're going to give me 50 acres of land. If I bring over 10 people, they're going to give me 500 acres of land. Now, if you pair this with the last slide, what do the indentured servants get after their service is over? They get 50 acres of land. So what this really is the government saying, we're going to give you 50 acres of land, you're going to hold it, and after the service is over, you're going to turn it over to the indentured servant. So they're holding it in trust. Now, what if my indentured servant dies? The government said, well, we've given it to the landowner. The indentured servant didn't make it. The landowner gets to keep it. And in a time when land means power, and the more land you have, the more you can plant, and the more money you make, the landowners start doing the math, and they realize that the government is giving them cheap land. So what ends up happening is, through the 1600s, the landowners start rewriting the contracts. And they start offering contracts that aren't as good as the original contracts. The first thing they try to take is the land. Okay, here's the deal. You're going to work for me. You're going to work for me for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, I'm going to give you some clothing. I'm going to give you maybe a pair of shoes. I'm going to give you some cash, and then you're going to be on your way. The indentured servant doesn't necessarily know the government has given them 50 acres. So I'm bringing indentured servants over. I'm getting land. That land is staying with me. It's never going to the indentured servant. Eventually, by the time you get to the end of the 1600s, the indentured servants, the contracts are, I'm going to pay for you to come over. You're going to work for me for 7 years. And at the end of that time, you're gone. Go somewhere else. I'm not taking care of you anymore. They eventually get nothing. Okay. Now, let's shift gears. Let's talk about the colony of Maryland. Maryland is also in the Chesapeake. Hopefully you remember that map. The colony of Maryland is founded by this guy named George Calvert. He's also known as Lord Baltimore. So if you start thinking, okay, people's places, city of Baltimore, named for him. And he was a Catholic. And he's a Catholic at a time in English history when Catholics are being persecuted. So he is fortunate enough, he's from nobility. The king owes him a debt. And so George Calvert makes a deal with the king in order to pay off the debt. The king will give him land in North America. That's going to become Maryland. And George Calvert will then set that colony up and allow Catholics to move there. Okay, so the idea of, let's get out of England. We're being persecuted, and so Catholics can move to Maryland. Honest to goodness, when their neighbors to the south in Virginia, who are good, loyal Church of England people, find out that there's a bunch of Catholics in Maryland, for a time, the people of Virginia declared war on the people of Maryland and started killing them. The king had to put a stop to it and order them, look, you're all English. It doesn't matter if you're Protestants or Catholics. You need to quit killing each other. Go kill the Spanish or somebody. And now, in Maryland, getting back to Maryland specifically, some of the original settlers were from the nobility in England. They didn't want to be Protestant. So when Henry created the Church of England, they kind of maintained their Catholic practices. They, priests met in secret, but they still have some money. They're just trying to keep it quiet. So they start trying to move to Maryland, and their goal was to recreate some version of feudalism. Now, we're not talking about going back to we're going to bring over serfs and tie them to the land and that aspect of feudalism, but just the manner in which they lived. Okay, you're going to have, the nobility. They're going to have these large estates, and we'll hire people, indentured servants, to come and work the estates. We'll have this large manor house that's kind of reminiscent of England. That was the goal. Again, the environment in Maryland, not that great, kind of like the Chesapeake. Just like Virginia, they're going to find their cash crop in tobacco. This is just a graph that shows you how important tobacco was to the economy as the export of tobacco just went up and up and up through the 1600s, and how, because the production of tobacco is going up, the price of it came down. Okay? So tobacco was the main cash crop there in Maryland. In 1649, something really important happens in Maryland. In 1649, the government of Maryland, under the direction of Lord Baltimore, create this thing that's called the Act of Toleration. The Act of Toleration is a huge event in colonial history, because the Act of Toleration declared that in the colony of Maryland, any person who believed in the Trinity, that is God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which is key to Christianity, anybody who believed in the Trinity was granted freedom of worship. Okay, Catholics believe in the Trinity, Protestants believe in the Trinity. Okay, so here was Lord Baltimore trying to get everyone to live together, and so they started letting Protestants move to Maryland. Uh, Unfun fact: when Protestants became the majority in Maryland, they voted to repeal the Act of Toleration and persecute the Catholics again. But they tried. They tried. This is a big deal. Right, let's go a little bit further south. Let's go actually a lot farther south to the Caribbean. But Mr. Strunk, the Caribbean isn't part of the United States. No, it's not, but it is a part of the British Southern Colonies because some of the Caribbean islands are British and they're definitely in the South. Okay, so here's the Caribbean, here's the islands. English possessions are going to include some of the important ones here: Jamaica, and then some of the smaller ones over here, the British Virgin Islands, Antigua, okay, St. Vincent, St. Lucia. Okay, so what's important about these Caribbean islands? Well, the Caribbean islands, the European powers, you can tell from the map if you want to go back and look at it again, it's split up by all the different European powers: the English, the French, the Spanish, everybody. The Caribbean islands are where the African slave trade was so important to those settlements and to those colonies. See, when the European powers took those places over, they enslaved the natives, and the natives all died out. By this point, you should have gone over the Columbian Exchange. You should have gone over the introduction of these diseases as part of what we call virgin soil epidemics. Okay? And so they needed people to work, and they needed them fast. And the African slave trade was right there. And so they brought over millions of African slaves to work on these islands, on the plantations. Most of them are going to be working on sugar plantations. The production of sugar, sugar was called a rich man's crop. Not because you're having to shell out a lot of money to grow the sugar, but because you're having to shell out a lot of money to refine. So you're having to refine it. Okay, the conditions are very difficult. Let me back up and show you that line again. The conditions are so difficult, they lead to these very high mortality rates. Okay, so you have a lot of slaves that are injured and definitely killed in the sugar process. I'll show you this real quick. You have to grind the sugar up. Okay, this is dangerous. These vats, you're boiling everything, and so something could go wrong. You could fall in. It could spill on you. If you suffer severe burns like that back then, you're probably going to die from infection. The vats could explode. Any number of things could happen that cause those high mortality rates. Now, some of the islands, the slave population very quickly outpaces the English population. One of these islands is Barbados. And so in Barbados, the English people who are in charge, they do the math and they realize, look, if the slaves figure out they've got the numbers, they can rise up and overthrow us. And so in Barbados, they enacted something called the Barbados Slave Code. It is a extremely brutal set of ways to enforce slavery, harsh punishments, even up to death for slight offenses. This is definitely one of the most cruel things that has ever been done in human history, and it's designed to keep the slave population in line, to keep them from daring to try to overthrow the local power structure. Because the guys in Barbados knew that if the slaves ever figured it out, they had the numbers and they could do it. So how do you keep them from doing it? You rule by fear, and you punish anything so severely nobody's going to want to do anything. Okay, now let's come back up to the mainland. Let's hit the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. Okay, this map shows you both of them. They're actually both founded in 1663. It was called Carolina. That's it. That's what it was called, Carolina. In 1712, the King of England is going to purchase South Carolina. And so there's a separation between North and South Carolina. Okay. But the Carolinas, the climate is basically like that of the Chesapeake. It's different enough that the mortality rate isn't as high, but the climate is still pretty similar. Just like the Chesapeake, the majority of the people that come over originally are indentured servants. They're coming over to work plantation agriculture again. In the Carolinas, they're going to shift their agriculture, and the cash crops they're going to grow there are indigo and rice. Indigo, if you don't know what indigo is, it is a dye. It's a flowering plant. You pull the blossoms off of it, the blooms off of it, and there's some version of blue or purple, depending on the soil, depending on the variety of indigo. And you take that and you boil it, and it creates a dye that you can dye clothing with. Very valuable cash crop. And then also rice. Because the population in the islands in the Caribbean is growing, and they're growing sugar. Well, we understand you can eat sugar. It's not necessarily nutritious, so they need nutrition. So they start growing rice for export back to the Caribbean. And in South Carolina, one of the things about South Carolina is a lot of the original settlers, a lot of the original landowners that were in South Carolina actually came from Barbados. They had moved to Barbados to grow sugar and have these sugar plantations, and so many people were growing sugar that the price of sugar collapsed and you couldn't make a profit. So when they failed, when their business model failed, they packed up and they moved to South Carolina to grow indigo and rice. This is why I had to go back and tell you about the Caribbean, because these guys who moved to South Carolina are going to bring the Barbados slave code with them. Now, hopefully, we all understand slavery is bad, but it is especially bad in South Carolina because they have that history of we came from Barbados, you have to treat people this way to keep them in line. And they're going to continue that when they establish South Carolina, and they're going to continue that through the history of South Carolina. Finally, our last of the southern colonies, Georgia. Georgia is there in the pink. Okay. Georgia is not only the last colony we'll talk about today, it's also the last of the 13 colonies to be founded. It was founded in 1733. It's the only colony to be founded in the 1700s, as a matter of fact. And the founder and the first governor of Georgia was this man, James Oglethorpe. James Oglethorpe was a member of parliament. He was a philanthropist. He had money and he wanted to use it to do good. And he believed that they needed to help people who were what are called debtors. People who had fallen into debt and could not recover. And English law back in the day, if you were a debtor, if you weren't paying off your debts, they could have you thrown into prison. Okay? And the prison would basically rent you out until your debt was paid off. But then when you got out of prison, you didn't have anything. So you had to go borrow money again. You still can't pay it off. And so it was a cycle that he and other people who believed like him wanted to break. And so they wanted to found Georgia as a colony for debtors. They could go, the group that managed Georgia would pay off their debts, and they would say, go there, and basically you're going to be like an indentured servant again. You'll work for the company, you'll work for the group for a couple of years, and then once that's done, we will give you land, you'll be able to start over. Now, the king is looking at it more from his own financial point of view. The debtors, the king could care less about them. What he cares about is Georgia being a buffer colony. Okay, so as I put the map back up, the map points out where the Carolinas are, but down here is Spanish Florida. And actually, this right here is disputed territory between England and Spain. So when the king is pitched the idea of Georgia, he thinks of Georgia being in the way between Spanish Florida and the very valuable colony of South Carolina and, of course, North Carolina. So the king is looking at this from the idea of if the Spanish were to try to invade, this would be a perfect avenue for them to attack my valuable colonies. So we'll put Georgia in the way as a buffer in order to block potential Spanish invasion. All right. Hope I didn't bore you too much with that. Hope you were able to get some information, and I hope that you keep coming back. Y'all have a great rest of your day.